Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Welcome to the second preparatory webinar, third NEA Stakeholder Involvement Workshop on Optimization and Decision Making. My name is Greg Lamar. I'm the head of division of the RP Hands group here at the Nuclear Energy Agency. Very happy to welcome people from around the world. I think we've got up to 90 registrants from what I heard who have registered to participate to this important event. It is now my pleasure to give the floor to the Director General of the NEA, Mr. William D. Magwood IV. Bill, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Greg, and welcome to this second preparatory webinar. As Greg mentioned in his opening remarks, we find this discussion about optimization to be a very complex and very interesting one. As you know, we are holding a in-person event in September that will examine the optimization and decision-making in the context of our stakeholder involvement workshops. It will be the third of our stakeholder workshops. And this particular subject of optimization is one that represents both a dramatic change in how governments and implementers relate to their stakeholders, but also one in which the community itself within the nuclear safety community finds that there's different approaches and definitions to optimization. This discussion I find to be one that is very exciting. But before we can really have a complete and successful workshop in September, we really have to begin to define what is meant by optimization. And that's really the purpose of these preparatory webinars. The program committee that has been working on this process felt that these webinars would be a good approach to get views from around the sector, from different perspectives, to understand what people were thinking when it came to optimization. And I think that the first webinar was one that was very helpful in helping us craft that. The first webinar focused on the importance of defining exactly who your stakeholders are in these processes. It's extraordinarily important. And also recognizing that it's important that these stakeholders, whoever they are, whoever you identify, be engaged in a very early and very meaningful way with a transparent decision-making process. I was very pleased. Our keynote speaker, U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commissioner David Wright, highlighted very clearly to the audience that there were three words for success: awareness, accountability, and authenticity. And I think that's a really important standard to hold as we go forward into today's webinar. Today's webinar focuses on what you might consider to be the centerpiece of the whole conversation of optimization. Optimization really at its basis is a selection of different paths forward for a particular situation, understanding the choices to be made by the stakeholder community. The stakeholders have to consider, for example, in cleaning up a radiologically contaminated site, do we leave some material in the ground and simply stabilize it? Or do we go to a completely clean 100% decontamination, which is sometimes not even possible and often very expensive. Stakeholders, when given information, we find make very good and very rational choices, but it requires time and it requires some effort. Today's discussion will focus on this issue of choices among the different options and the consequences they have for the stakeholders. And the stakeholder impacts may not be the same across the whole stakeholder community. How do you deal with that? Today's webinar will introduce approaches and tools to balance these very different competing aspects that are often very difficult to compare. And we'll discuss how to do so in a robust way, including a way that involves the stakeholders in every stage of the process, following again their awareness, accountability, and the authenticity of the decision-making process. We're looking forward to a roster of distinguished speakers. Following me will be Commissioner Bond from the Nuclear Regulatory Authority of Japan, who is a very close partner of the NEA and involved in many of these discussions. You'll also be hearing from Haiti Tedros, who's Director General from the Director of Environmental and Radiation Protection and Assessment with the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, another very important partner of ours. And we're also looking forward to expert presentations. Mr. Goliev, who's Professor of Economics from the Toulouse School of Economics, and Tristan Barr, who is with Health Canada. So you're going to hear from some experts who bring an important perspective to these discussions. And as we put together this body of knowledge going into our workshop in September, I certainly hope that we position ourselves to have a very fulsome and successful discussion in September that will really help us once and for all be able to have an understanding about what optimization means and really have a roadmap for how to carry it off in the most successful way. So now to begin our discussion today, I invite Commissioner Bond to take the floor and to give his keynote remarks. Commissioner Bond, the floor is yours.
Thank you, DG Magut, for your kind introduction. First, I would like to thank DG Magut and the NEA staff for inviting me to this stimulating webinar. As I have been working for decades in the field of radiation protection, optimization is a fundamental concept for me. It is simple and clear, but not easy to implement. The question is how to make an optimized decision in a consistent manner. There have been a lot of attempts and efforts to achieve it in practice. We can trace the history of these efforts in the relevant ICRP publications. It was 1983 when ICRP published a specific report on this topic. The title of the report was Cost-Benefit Analysis in the Optimization of Radiation Protection. Another report followed 7 years later to explain various decision-aiding techniques other than cost-benefit analysis. In those days, attention was paid mostly on how to ensure the rationality of decision in balancing between health detriment of radiation, financial cost of protection, and some other things such as discomfort of protective equipment. ICRP was aware of the broader social context, but it was considered beyond the scope of radiation protection. This situation changed in 2006 when ICRP released Publication 101 entitled The Optimization of Radiation Protection, Broadening the Process. If my understanding is correct, it was the first time the ICRP referred to stakeholder involvement. When I first learned this concept, I thought ICRP abandoned its ideal of rational decision and proposed a democratic process instead as a realistic approach. To be honest, I was somewhat cynical as it sounded like a wimpy attitude to me. However, the Fukushima Daiichi accident changed my awareness. I came to realize the importance of stakeholder involvement as a prerequisite for holistic approach. In the aftermath of the accident, there was a sudden demand for experts in radiation. I was not an exception and was involved in lectures and risk communication activities in various opportunities. I did my best to convey scientific knowledge, to answer questions, and to give advice about how to avoid unnecessary exposure in everyday life. But I never felt I was very helpful. Simply put, My expertise was limited to doses and effects or risks of radiation, but the problem was more than that. Life became quite different for people in the affected areas. The changes in the living environment brought them various difficulties, such as stigmatization, empty feeling, and community severance. There is no doubt that the root cause was radioactive contamination, but just providing accurate knowledge about radiation did not bring solutions. The situation in Fukushima gave me some important lessons. First, individual expertise is limited and not enough to solve real-life problems. Experts from a wide range of disciplines need to be involved. It is also necessary to mobilize all available knowledge and skills to confront the entire situation, rather than breaking down problems to fit into each individual discipline. Second, we should be humble to admit that not everything is predictable nor quantifiable. This particularly applies to social consequences. In many cases, we can only discuss what could happen through the exchange of insights and experiences. Nevertheless, it is not unusual that the situation takes an unexpected turn. And finally, what is good or best is not necessarily obvious. In Fukushima, people's life was more or less disturbed by protective measures against radiation. In particular, evacuees experienced drastic change. They found difficulty in managing their own life regarding housing, livelihood, childcare, and so on. Many issues came together at the same time, and they lost their perspective. Under such circumstances, it is necessary to repeat dialogues with the people to prioritize key issues, and individual values need to be respected in that process. These lessons tell us involving stakeholders is essential in taking a holistic approach to address the difficult situation caused by the nuclear accident. But it is not confined to such extreme cases. Considering wide-ranging implications of nuclear and radiation-related activities, the same will apply to every situation where decisions are made on issues of concern for society. A clear benefit of stakeholder involvement is to ensure that the issue is deliberated from various aspects. Involving organizations and individuals from different disciplines will help cover major points and incorporate up-to-date information. It is important to seek greater diversity, not only for scientific and technical aspects, but also for ethical and social considerations. Nuclear-related issues are inevitably controversial, and there are diverse and competing perspectives. If stakeholders with different views are appropriately selected, and they can exchange their points of view in a constructive manner, that process itself will be a way to seek an optimal solution. Some might say that this way of decision-making is just compromising. It is true that the final decision reached through this process is a compromise as everyone has to give up some of the things they want. But I want to take the word compromise in good part. It means that each stakeholder takes steps forward to a common goal. In this context, well-designed stakeholder involvement embodies the concept of optimization. The NEA paid attention to stakeholder involvement from early on and has been taking a leading role in international discussions. Nevertheless, some practical aspects remain to be elaborated. For example, guidance will be needed on how to identify stakeholders, how to organize and facilitate rounds of discussions, and how to balance conflicting views. I hope we can share common awareness of the issues through today's webinar to make the main workshop in September the most fruitful. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Bond, for those keynote words and addresses. We have maybe a minute or two for some questions. Maybe I will, I'll read this one out to you, Commissioner Bond. One of our participants has said, you talk about stakeholders properly selected. Is having a selection process itself already not a potential source of bias? Should stakeholders not be accepted on their input on the basis of their felt need to participate? So it's a little bit about how we go about selecting the stakeholders and some considerations as to whether or not their desired need to input into the process should be one of the more fundamental considerations.
Yeah, I agree on that point. And actually, I don't have any specific answer. But so in the case of big decision, we cannot involve all the peoples interested in that matter. So we need to select some of them in some way. So I think it is one of the important issues to be discussed in this workshop.
Thank you very much. Once again, Commissioner Bond, thank you so very much for your words. We'll now move along, and it gives me great pleasure to give the floor to Heidi Tedros. Heidi is the chair of the workshop program committee for the third stakeholder involvement workshop, and she is also the Director General, the Directorate of Environmental and Radiation Protection and Assessment at the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. Heidi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Greg, and hello to everyone. Thank you to DG Magwood and Commissioner Bond for an outstanding opening for our discussions and our webinars today. It is with great pleasure on behalf of the program committee that I am here, and I will be moderating this webinar as we go forward. A little bit about what you can expect today. Today's workshop, as mentioned, today's webinar, as mentioned by DG Magwood, will focus on optimization and decision making. This is the second webinar that we've had. The first one was held in December 14th. And these preparatory webinars will set the stage and provide common ground for our discussions in September for the workshop that is being prepared. The workshop objectives, as was alluded to, will address the notion of optimization and decision making, and recognizing that this area is such a wide, complex, and highly interesting area for all individuals, whether you are in the nuclear industry or stakeholders. We took the approach of creating these preparatory webinars to bring forward some understanding of what we mean by optimization, especially in the case of stakeholders. And as Commissioner Bond has expressed to us, it is vital to use experiences that we've each had and go forward with our thoughts and our insights so as to provide a wholesome approach, a holistic approach, as some would say, that is sustainable into the future. The final objective for the workshop will be to create some of these guiding principles that Commissioner Bond has brought forward so that all member states of the NEA can look to these guiding principles and approach decision-making in their respective areas in a more consistent, holistic, sustainable manner. So you'll hear these words regularly throughout sort of our objectives for today in the webinar and also for the workshop. Similar to the first webinar, we will have a series of presentations that will provoke sort of thought processes, will provoke opening remarks. And then for the second part, the last hour, we will have a discussion period through breakout sessions that again will be moderated. We anticipate approximately 5 groups of 12 to 15 participants. And overall, my impressions in terms of just setting the stage for what you can expect, already you have heard some outstanding insights shared with regards to what we are looking at today, specifically for this second webinar, how to balance competing aspects and interests in decision making. So with that, the first webinar dealt more so with how to better scope and formulate problems for holistic, inclusive, and sustainable decisions. And as was requested in the question, we looked at the question about what stakeholders should get involved. And there will be a recording of the first webinar, and all of the inputs from all 3 webinars will be put forward into the workshop, and we will have sort of like a place document to bring together all the thoughts that were shared. So with that, I would like to highlight that today's webinar is definitely the second phase of our series here today. We will be discussing balancing competing aspects, and that we wish that everyone participate holistically and fully engaged. And we look forward to hosting the third webinar in early February. I believe the date is the 8th of February, so please mark your calendars, with the workshop being the first week in September. With that, on behalf of the program committee, I wish you an insightful webinar. Please encourage to participate throughout the discussions. And I would now like to pass the floor to our first speaker, our first presenter, Christian Gaulier, Professor of Economics at the founder of the Toulouse School of Economics. Mr. Gaulier will present us the challenges of using cost-benefit analysis and other approaches within the nuclear sector. Monsieur Gaulier, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Heidi. Thank you very much for the invitation. So I'm a specialist of climate economics, but I also work on nuclear energy over the last 30 years. But today I would like to explore with you the challenges of using cost-benefit analysis within the nuclear sector. And so I will try to bring light from my own experience in this domain more generally, not necessarily covering nuclear sector. So when we think about optimizing, and if we take a normative point of view, that is, we try to optimize the welfare, the social welfare. And so, if this general word, social welfare, does not mean anything if we do not define exactly what are the dimensions and what are the stakeholders dealing with this problem. So, implicitly, this raises the question: what are our collective goals, and how our policies or actions affect the realization of these goals. So the problem, we have 2 problems when we do that. The first problem is when we take an action, for example, a nuclear decision to expand the nuclear electricity in a country. We have many dimensions in the impact. We have the impact on purchasing power, because maybe nuclear electricity is cheaper than other sources of electricity, but there are also other sources of impacts, like environmental impact or social impact, that need to be taken into account. How do we take into account this different source of impact, and how do we value that? That's one important element that need to be taken into account in the debate. The second difficulty when we do that is when we take an action, most of the impacts of those actions are not only multidimensional, but they are also uncertain. And so then there is this big question in cost-benefit analysis and socioeconomic evaluation about how to take into account of the uncertainty surrounding the impacts of our decision. And in particular in the nuclear sector and in the electricity sector, and more generally the energy transition problem, because of the time duration of the consequence of our action today, the uncertainties should matter a lot. So the big question here I would like to address in the second part of my presentation: how do we take into account those uncertainties? What the good news is that we have been working in the economics literature. We've been working a lot thinking about this, how to deal with risk and uncertainties when we value things, when we value investment, when we evaluate public policies. And so a normative view of this literature, of asset pricing literature, should be useful to apprehend the way we should take into account uncertainty when we think about, for example, the relative merit of the nuclear electricity compared to other sources of electricity. So my presentation will be split in three pieces. First thing, I would like to remind you the importance of trying to value impacts. So value multidimensional impacts that allow us to compare cost and benefits using a single dimension, which is used in dollars or euros or yen, and then I will explore very quickly two simple examples, a trivial example on tomatoes and energy transition, and the other one on speed and highways to illustrate the multidimensionality problem in cost-benefit analysis. And then I will move to the second part, which is how to deal with uncertainty using economics and finance literature to explore the consequence on nuclear sector in particular. How do we treat nuclear waste, and how do we value investment to take care of those wastes? And finally, I will say a few words about deep uncertainties. So a trivial example, you know that there are a myriad of possible actions to reduce emissions of CO2, that is to fight against climate change. One simple example would be when I go to the market, I need to purchase tomatoes. I could purchase local tomatoes. I'm not living in a place where there is a lot of sun. Therefore, those tomatoes are quite expensive. I could purchase tomatoes that are produced in places where there is no sun, for example, Spain. So the tomatoes will be cheaper, but in order to bring those tomatoes to my market, those tomatoes are transported by truck, and that generates CO2. So then the question, my personal question, but probably your question too, is how do we take care of this CO2 emissions in my decision, in your decision to purchase local tomatoes that are more expensive, that affect negatively my purchasing power compared to the impact, the environmental impact of purchasing Spanish tomatoes. So as long as we refuse to put a value on CO2, it will be very difficult for every one of us to perform this optimization, to solve this optimization problem of how to behave in a responsible way. So not only it will be difficult as long as we refuse to put a value on CO2, but it's also a potential of extremely inefficient way to allocate the effort of CO2 reduction. Maybe I will decide to myself to purchase only local tomatoes, but for me this is very expensive compared to other solutions that would be much less expensive. As long as we refuse to perform this cost-benefit analysis by putting a value on carbon, this optimization problem of allocating the effort will fail. Next slide, please. Another example is related to speed limit. In France, there is currently a debate to reduce speed limit on highways. And of course, when we think about whether this is socially desirable, whether it's a step toward optimizing efforts to reduce emission of CO2, because reducing speed on highway will reduce consumption of gasoline and therefore will reduce CO2 emission. Whether this specific action is socially desirable or not, you need to take into account many other impacts on individual welfare. So, for example, speed limit, reduction of speed limit will increase the time spent to go from point A to point B, and because time is money, we should take into account of the fact that losing time in your car negatively affects your welfare. So then the question is, how do we value time? Also, people will save their life by driving at a smaller speed. How do we value life? So we will reduce gasoline consumption. How do we value the fact that we increase purchasing power of the people who accept to reduce their speed on highways? And finally, people will emit less CO2 by driving at a smaller speed. And how do we value CO2? As long as we refuse to put values on things, it will be almost impossible individually to determine what's the optimal strategy. And moreover, at the aggregate level, at the collective level, it will be almost impossible to determine what's the socially desirable strategy. So without putting values on things, there is no way to optimize. There is no way to get to a rational solution. And moreover, without putting value on things, it will be very difficult to have a debate with the stakeholder, because when you put on the table values and when you measure an impact and you value those impact with those prices or value, you are able to start a conversation with people who are disagreeing with the recommendation. Because if you disagree with the recommendation, it's maybe because we disagree on the value, and then let's talk about the value. Why do we disagree on the value? And so that would start, I think, a rational way to approach a public debate on different issues. Next slide, please. So that's for my cost-benefit analysis. Now, what about risk? Okay, in the nuclear sector, decision to put nuclear waste in deep storage under our feet will have impact for a long period of time, and those impacts are uncertain, and the value of those impacts will be also uncertain. So how do we treat those uncertainty? Because if the cost and benefits are uncertain, it will be very hard to determine whether the benefit is larger than the cost, if the benefit is uncertain, if the cost is uncertain. So how do we apprehend those sorts of uncertainty to help the decision-making process? So over the last 50 years in finance, we have discovered that people are risk averse, and so we should take care of actions of investment that increase the macroeconomic risk, which is borne by the people who are risk averse. So the idea is very simple. What we should do is to perform all actions whose expected benefit is larger than the expected cost. Okay, so that would be risk neutral, but we would take into account of the riskiness of the benefits and of the cost by discounting these flows of benefits and discounting the flow of cost at a discount rate that take into account of the riskiness and the risk aversion of the people. And the idea is we should discount the net benefits of project whose increase the macroeconomic risk. We should discount them at the larger discount rate, and we should reduce the discount rate for projects that hedge or that insure against the macroeconomic risk. So that would be something desirable from the point of view of risk-averse stakeholder. And so, for example, in France, that's what we do to perform cost-benefit analysis. So what we do in France, we ask the evaluators of different projects, nuclear or in any other sectors, we ask the evaluators to estimate the betas of their project. And the beta of a project is the income elasticity of the social net benefit. So if this income elasticity is positive, this means that this project generates more benefits when the society is prosperous and generate less benefit when we are in a recession. And so this kind of project tends to magnify the macro risk compared to a project where the income elasticity would be negative, where the beta would be negative, in which case, you know, the benefits of the project will be larger when the society faces a big reduction in GDP, a big reduction in income. So you see, that would play a role of an insurance contract, you know, providing an indemnity, a net benefit that is larger in those bad states of the world. And so for those projects, we should give a bonus to those projects when we evaluate them. And we do that in France by evaluating the net benefits of the project at a smaller discount rate. And so technically what we do is to use a discount rate, which is these days 1.2%, which would be a discount rate to be used for risk-free project. But we add to this risk-free discount rate the risk premium, which is equal to beta, the project-specific beta, time 2%. So for example, typically for railways infrastructure, we know that the income elasticity of the net benefits of railways infrastructure is around 2. So that implies that beta is equal to 2. So applying this formula would tell us that we should discount the flow of expected net benefits of this project at 5.2%, okay, compared to, for example, typically a health infrastructure like a hospital. Typically for this kind of project, net benefits is negatively correlated with GDP. And so beta here, I take a beta of minus 0.5. So you see that investing in health infrastructure as an insurance benefit for society, and that we translated into a bonus for health infrastructure project by using a discount rate of only 0.2%. Okay, so that's the idea. So, and then you can conjugate this idea to all sectors, examining the beta of the different projects there, and then applying the rule. So one of the questions, for example, is what's the beta of electricity infrastructure? Do we think that when expanding electricity capacity in a country, that will have a more positive impact when the country is more prosperous, or when the country is in a recession? The answer to that question will determine whether the electric beta is positive or negative. Next slide, please. So I have a special example for that, which is CGO. So CGO project is, you may know, this project to store nuclear waste of the second generation of nuclear power plant in France. The cost of storing those waste 500 meters underground is estimated these days around 25 billion euros. And we could compare this possible investment with doing nothing. And the status quo doing nothing option will consist in continuing to pay forever 100 million euros every year to maintain and make sure that there is no leakage in the current surface storage of those nuclear waste. So the question is, do we prefer to spend 25 billions within the next 10 or 20 years to get rid of those nuclear waste, or should we prefer to spend 100 billion euros every year to keep and maintain those storage, those waste on surfaces? Well, you see, you do the math. If we use in France a discount rate smaller or larger than 0.4%, you should prefer the status quo and not implementing the CGO project. Okay, but well, then the question is, in France, what's the beta of the CGO project? Okay, if beta equals 0, if it's a risk-free project, we should use 1.2% discount rate, and therefore CGO should not be done. But maybe CGO has an insurance benefit for society. And here, let me just give you an illustration of the potential of this insurance story associated to having a definitive storage capacity of nuclear waste. Well, there is, when we talk with my colleagues in nuclear sector, they always come with this idea that one day Western civilization will disappear, and then those nuclear waste, if they remain on surfaces, people will not do what to do with that, and they will disseminate those waste, maybe using for construction inputs and things like that, and that will be a catastrophe, sanitary catastrophe or environmental catastrophe. And so you see, with big consequence on welfare, and the value of those impact will be enormous, will be very large. And you see that will happen in the bad state of nature, okay, when GDP will be very small, Western civilization is out, okay? So you see that the beta is negative with that story. CGO has generated positive effect, which is not having to face those environmental and health impacts in case of a chaotic evolution of our society in state of the world that are very negative. So CGO as a negative beta, is the beta negative enough to get to a discount rate which is smaller than 0.4%? That's an issue I will not answer today, but I wrote a report on that last year for the French government. You may have a look. So now, if I have a minute, let me finish with the next slide. Of course, as Commissioner Ban said earlier, I mean, not everything is quantifiable. Okay, so in particular, in the sector, in the nuclear sector, we have a big difficulty, for example, to estimate the probability of a nuclear accident in a nuclear power plant. Okay, Fukushima, Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island. What's the probability that this year a French nuclear reactor will have a problem and they generate a large leakage of nuclear materials? Well, frankly, I know we have this 1 over 1 million probability, which is quite theoretical. The truth is we don't know. Okay, so then the question is, well, I cannot use my approach of, manipulating the discount rate on the estimation of the beta. This beta, I will not be able to estimate because I don't have the probabilities. And we know that, people do not consider the lotteries A and lotteries B presented on this slide as equivalent, okay, which is something we would consider as equivalent as an economist. Lottery A is earning 100 euros with probability 0.5, and lottery B is earning 100 euros with the unknown probability with mean 0.5. Okay, so these two things, people do not react in the same way. They are not equivalently impacted on their welfare by having to face one or the other lottery. And we should take into account of this psychological aspects of what we call the ambiguity aversion. People are not only risk averse, they are also ambiguity averse. And maybe in the nuclear electricity sector, it's a problem that we need to take into account. The problem is that the economic literature has no clear operational recommendation to make to take care of this kind of deep uncertainty, this kind of ambiguity aversion. And so let me stop here with this rather negative result that we still have a lot of work to perform in order to be really operational in providing recommendation for how to take care of risk and uncertainty in the nuclear sector. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much to you, Monsieur Gaulier. It's a very fascinating subject and obviously a wealth of experience there as well. I particularly enjoyed your practical examples. I think this is the kind of practical examples that bring the issues to life. We have a few questions in the chat that we have some minutes to go through. So perhaps I will start at the top, and if we do not have a chance to go through them all, perhaps I invite you, Monsieur Gaulier, if you can, to look at the chat and maybe type in an answer to help move our day forward. Thank you. So the first one is about traffic fatalities. Wouldn't traffic fatalities also be reduced to a reduction in the speed limit? What about that benefit?
Yes, indeed. In the slide, I did not write that impact on the slide, but you are right. I mean, and that's where cost-benefit analysis is useful, because it forces you to be able to react to, okay, you forgot this impact, and what about this impact? How should we value it? Well, it happens that, in fact, I wrote an op-ed in Journal Le Monde last month on this, and I mentioned that I didn't take into account of health impact of reducing the speed limit. The point is that in France, there are only quote unquote, it's always too many, but there are only 200 dead every year on highways. There are other dead people on roads, but highways are very safe in France. So even if you completely eliminate death on highways in France, the impact on the cost-benefit analysis, so it's a second order impact. And so indeed, I should have added that on the slide, but you know, as you may know, writing on a pad in a journal, you need to simplify to the most important element. And the most important element, when you do the math and the cost-benefit analysis for highways, you know, it's really time lost, gasoline consumption, and CO2 emissions.
Thank you very much for that. The next question, perhaps not so much for yourself, sir, but deals more so with the Aarhus Convention and some of the definitions that are found there with regards to framing of the nuclear activities. And the question is more so, is the definition sufficient, and should the circle of stakeholders be expanded? So perhaps what I would suggest, if you are comfortable maybe sharing some of the thoughts on that, that would be great. If not, maybe what we can do is bring that question forward into our discussion point, because this is exactly the kinds of questions we need to be asking ourselves. And I trust that by the time we get to the workshop, this question will be a major question that we need to circle back to and provide some guidance on what is that circle of stakeholders that we should be looking at. Is it there is no circle and they should all be included, or is there a framing that needs to happen? And this was the center of the discussions at our last webinar. But perhaps, Monsieur Gaulier, seeing as we have you, do you have any thoughts on that in terms of the circle of stakeholders?
Well, not on the circle, not on the perimeter, but on the methodology. I think, you know, and on principles. Okay, we live in a democratic world, the Western world, with democracy, democratic value, and indeed we have an issue associated to how to organize the public debate around that kind of issues of nuclear electricity. I mean, keep in mind that in many countries, a majority of the citizens believe that nuclear electricity produces more CO2 than coal and natural gas. So then how do we organize the debate in this world where many people have a biased view and a biased view of the facts? Okay, and so that's again where the discipline of a cost-benefit analysis, where we put on the table the measure of the impacts. Okay, how many CO2 1 kilowatt hour of nuclear electricity produce? How many? I mean, what's the cost? What's the financial cost of? What's the environmental impact, and so on and so on. And then we talk about the values, and then we talk about comparing the net benefit and the net cost using those measurements of the impact and those values. And then you disagree with the outcome that the net benefits is positive. Well, let us look at where you disagree on the table. What's the ingredient we put on the table that generate the outcome? Where do we disagree? And if you do not disagree, you should accept the conclusion. If not, let's go deeper to the values of things.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that insight. And what I heard from you is sometimes it really does depend on the question being asked, which factors into that methodology that you spoke of, and depending on how many stakeholders should be involved, who should the stakeholders be. But thank you for that. And really this leads into the next and maybe final question, recognizing the time, is, and this is something I was wondering about as you were speaking, is whose value counts the most, so to speak. So I think the question is specific to how do we deal with people's emotions? How do we calculate that?
Well, that's where interdisciplinary approach matter, okay? Behavioral impact, I mean, psychological impacts of, perceptions and perception of fairness or unfairness of the policy matters. Also, I mean, in this highway story on speed limit, I use in the evaluation, I use average wage to measure the value of time. And people told me, oh, that's mean implicitly you mean that the hours I earn by increasing my speed, I will use it to work more and therefore earn one more hour of wage. And then, but not me. I would prefer to use leisure to take this additional hour of earn because I speed faster, I drive faster. I will use it as a leisure. But then my answer is simple. So that means if you use it as leisure, it means that the value of your leisure is larger than the value of the hourly wage, and therefore that's also, so that's an underestimation of the true value for you of this one additional or earned by driving faster. And so again, that's where we need to have a debate. So in the value of things, indeed, you are right. People may have different values on different things. At the end of the day, we need to aggregate all those different values in one way or another.
Merci beaucoup. Fascinating subject, and thank you very much for sharing your insights. We do need to move on, but I do want to give the opportunity for yourself to look at the questions in the chat. Very engaging questions, and as you say, we need to have the debate. So I suspect we are starting that as of today. So thank you again for your time and being with us here today, and thank you for all of our participants for putting their questions. So with that, I would like to move forward and provide the floor to our next speaker, who will introduce an example from the nuclear sector, so a situational awareness piece. A former colleague of mine who is in Canada, Mr. Tristan Barr, he is currently the section head of the Planning, Outreach, Exercises and Training section at Health Canada. And Mr. Barr will share some insights from Health Canada's proposed tool for selecting proactive actions in a nuclear emergency in an effort to balance radiological and non-radiological impacts. Tristan, please.
Heidi, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm thrilled to follow Dr. Codier because I think I will be providing an example of a cost-benefit analysis effectively that we have performed in order to attempt to quantify the psychosocial impacts of protective actions so that we could balance them against the radiological impacts of those same protective actions, effectively balancing the detriments of the protective action, both on the psychosocial side as well as the radiological side. The premise of the research that we did is effectively that we're well aware that current nuclear emergency response plans are well established, and they really provide guidance on radiation dose thresholds for implementing protective actions to minimize radiation doses. Those protective actions are effectively sheltering, potassium iodide tablets, evacuation. And evacuation in particular is a protective action that we saw implemented following the Fukushima Daiichi disaster, and we are able now to understand and measure some of the psychosocial impacts that came as a consequence, and also understand and measure the radiological impacts to the population. So recognizing that some protective actions that minimize radiation doses may increase the psychosocial impact of the population, particularly evacuation and relocation, what we attempted to do was to develop a unit or a tool to compare psychosocial detriment to radiation detriment. In terms of a unit, I'm sure everybody in this audience is very familiar with a millisievert, it being a measure of overall detriment from the exposure to radiation. It looks at the biological health impacts of radiation exposure. But what it doesn't measure are those psychosocial or mental health impacts of either the radiation exposure or the protective actions associated to it. So the tool, if we could develop it, or the unit, would help us both justify and optimize our protective action decisions, such as evacuation and relocation, and build those into a protection strategy. So I'll quickly go over what we did. Effectively, we failed to develop a non-radiological sievert or unit. However, we do have a proof of concept tool that we can now propose to use, and we'd love feedback from the audience on this proof of concept tool to make those decisions about whether or not to evacuate based on a cost-benefit analysis, looking at the detriment or benefit from evacuation versus non-evacuation. So our project was executed in 2 phases, and effectively we performed a literature review to look at those common psychosocial impacts that result from nuclear emergencies, with a view to understanding the specific drivers for those impacts. So what is it that drives the psychosocial impacts following a nuclear emergency? And then, of course, we wanted to identify measurement tools that could be used to understand that psychosocial impact in a nuclear context. And from there, of course, we wanted to develop that unit, effectively weighting the various psychosocial impacts and the drivers for them in order to compare them with the radiological detriment. So that would lead to a decision support tool. Now, we were able eventually to develop a decision support tool, but in looking to derive it, we recognized that while most of the valuable information on psychosocial and mental health impacts following a nuclear emergency really come from the Fukushima Daiichi incident, there are some important cultural differences between the Japanese population and the Canadian population, and we really wanted to identify a Canadian tool that incorporated Canadian culture and potentially the relative either resilience or non-resilience of the population to evacuation and relocation. So we looked for Canadian data to develop our kind of starting point of psychosocial impacts from evacuation and relocation. We looked at the existing literature to develop a structure for our tool using quantitative estimates from Fukushima Daiichi effectively to quantify those potential impacts. And then we built and tested our tool over several iterations. So the literature review effectively identified much of the same information that Commissioner Ban was explaining earlier on. And we noted that, or we found that the main drivers for psychosocial and mental health impacts following evacuation and relocation were residence-related factors, risk perception issues, and the socioeconomic changes that came about as a consequence of the evacuation and relocation. And what we attempted to do was effectively propose a weighting factor for each of these drivers so that would contribute to an overall psychosocial detriment. We had the drivers listed on the left, the residence changes, risk perception, socioeconomic changes, and on the right here you see the outcomes, right? So the measurable outcomes as a consequence of changes to those drivers. So these are the main ones, but there are of course many different psychosocial detriment outcomes. But these included depression, PTSD, anxiety, suicide rates, and increased substance abuse rates. And the objective, just like a millisievert, would have been to effectively weight the different drivers and to weight the different outcomes, just as we do for weighting different types of radiation and weighting the different impacts on different organs in the body in order to come up with a single unit of psychosocial detriment as a consequence of evacuation and relocation. Now, you'll notice I put a big failed sticker on my slide because we were unable to do that, and I'll quickly explain why. So effectively, we noted that the data was not available to generate this non-radiological sievert that we were trying to create. And this is because mental health and psychosocial impacts from nuclear emergencies have been measured with general and summary indicators. So identifying the prevalence of the various mental health outcomes was difficult. because the general indicators don't allow us to tease out the specific detriments. Further to that, there was a Nuclear Regulatory Commission paper in 2021 that quantifies various non-radiological health effects from evacuations and relocations. And this was a nuclear paper, but looked at the impact of evacuation and relocation across all different hazard types. And specifically, it identifies that those various non-radiological health effects are not additive. So you cannot effectively sum the detriment of the different psychosocial impacts into a single unit. Further, we noted that we couldn't weight the psychosocial impacts and sum them up to get a Sievert-like unit at the time, obviously. And we needed, if we wanted to continue in this area, specific studies on the non-radiological health effects that measure each health effect as well as their combined effect. So at this time, we were unable to effectively dissociate the interference between the relative links between the multiple mental health and psychosocial impacts. All this to say, we couldn't develop our single Sievert-like unit for non-radiological impacts. I have another failed slide here because we did recall to generate a Canadian model based on Canadian cultural and psychosocial health parameters. So there was a significant flood in Alberta back in 2013, and we looked at the psychosocial impacts of evacuation and relocation, which did occur around that flood, in order to quantify the changes that we would see in a Canadian community that underwent relocation and evacuation. However, the data that we had came from the Canadian Community Health Survey. There were pre and post flood surveys completed, and we were unable to identify a significant impact on the psychosocial and mental health of the population that were impacted by the flood. So we were not able to generate our Canadian model, basically. So having failed at generating our Sievert-like unit, having failed at generating a Canadian model, we changed approaches, and I want to now present quickly this proof of concept tool that we came up with. I have a series of slides here that are heavy and have a lot of information. I've provided them so that the audience can, in time, review effectively how we generated our tool. But I will simply highlight the methodology that we used and drive down to how the tool actually performs. So the next few slides I will cover very quickly. But the concept effectively was to do a cost-benefit analysis to compare non-evacuation versus evacuation, recognizing that if people were not evacuated, there might be psychosocial costs for non-evacuation, or there might be psychosocial benefits from non-evacuation. Similarly, there are radiological costs from non-evacuation. We recognize that the dose would be higher, and there would be radiological benefits for evacuation. So on the evacuation side, we included psychosocial cost of evacuation as well as the radiological cost. And to note, in our model or in our tool, this is optional. You can add that or remove it. And on the non-evacuation side, we have psychosocial costs or benefits from non-evacuation and the radiological cost for non-evacuation. So we had to effectively monetize the cost of psychosocial impacts of non-evacuation. This slide you will see, if you read through it carefully, describes the values that we assigned and how we came up with those values. But effectively, we came up with a methodology to assign a cost to the psychosocial impacts of non-evacuation, and generally, non-evacuation is considered to be to drive better psychosocial and mental health outcomes than evacuation. Similarly, we estimated the psychosocial impacts of evacuation. So again, this slide demonstrates how we drove down to it. The key points here are that we used, at the end of the day, recall that we could not add or sum the multiple mental health or psychosocial impacts that would come about as a consequence of evacuation. So we picked a single one, which was the prevalence of depression, and we assigned a value, effectively a monetary value, to the increased rates of depression among the population that would be evacuated to come up with our estimated cost of evacuation. In order to account for radiological impacts, we had to assign a cost to radiological impacts. This was taken effectively from U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission monetization values that were published in 2014 and extrapolated into Canadian dollars in 2020. And this effectively, demonstrates how we did the calculation. Having assigned effectively costs for evacuation and non-evacuation, we generated our model, which is relatively simple and effectively compares the cost of non-evacuation to the cost of evacuation to provide us with a net evacuation impact. So recognizing that if this value is positive, it means that the cost of non-evacuation is higher than the cost of evacuation, and vice versa. So what does that look like in practice? If you could flip to the next slide, please. I have here run our tool for two different scenarios, and I need to give a quick explanation of how we grouped our data. So what you see here on the x-axis is the distance from a nuclear facility. We used a Canadian nuclear facility in a densely populated area. And the gray circles represent what we call forward sortation areas. A forward sortation area is part of our postal code system, and it's effectively the first 3 digits of our 6-digit postal code. So it describes a relatively constrained area within that 60-kilometer radius or 57-kilometer radius around the nuclear power plant. So you have effectively a cost-benefit analysis here graphed against dollars. What we have on the left is running the tool, looking at the default parameters. However, recognizing we can change all of the parameters that we have used here, including the reference levels that we use for how much at the level of dose that we would use to trigger evacuation, for example, the assigned monetization value for those sieverts received versus the assigned monetization value for the quality of life years lost effectively from either the radiation dose or from the depression impacts. But the key here is that, and this speaks, I think, to a lot of what Dr. Courier was saying, is that depending on the values that we assign, and these are societal discussions that need to occur, but the values we assign in this case to a quality of life year, on the left side, we've assigned $50,000 quality of life year value, which is a standard practice used in Canada, but I would suggest relatively low, to a $100,000 Canadian dollar quality of life year on the right. The difference that you will see is that the tool would say that within 20 kilometers, the forward sortation areas that are within that range should be evacuated, whereas the ones outside of 20 kilometers should not be evacuated based on all the default values. However, if we increase the quality of life year value to $100,000, the model looks very different and would suggest that only 1 or 2 maybe forward sortation areas ought to be evacuated within that 20-kilometer range outside of the nuclear power plant. Now, the next 2 slides basically describe the impact of the various key parameters on the results of the model in terms of whether or not it would suggest that it's worth evacuating or not. So I just, in the interest of time, I don't want to go through all of them and would allow you to, or suggest that you take some time to review these. But note that some of those key parameters are life satisfaction, depression prevalence, because remember, depression is really the only psychosocial impact that we've or that we've used here for our model. The monetary value of equality, as you've seen, is an extremely important value in terms of how it influences the outcomes of the model. Income, interestingly, I think Dr. Collier also mentioned this, but income has, the total income of recipients has an important impact on the model because we are talking about effectively costs at the end of the day. And the projected dose, of course, that we assign to a population, if evacuated or not, will also have an important role to play on the outcomes of the model. Just a quick slide for those of you who are data and analysis inclined. We did a sensitivity analysis to look at the model and how the various key parameters affect the model. So of course, the outcomes will change very much based on the values essentially that we choose for our parameters. And so you see that's a repeated pattern, but at different levels depending on those key parameters, particularly life satisfaction and depression in this analysis. And then our final slide, I hope. No, 2 more slides. So the question really that I want to bring to this group is, I think what we have here is a proof of concept decision tool. It's not ready for use, I would suggest. We need to publish it and we need to get feedback from the scientific community. But what I think we do have is an important contribution to evidence-based guidance on a justified and optimized protection strategy that includes the consideration of psychosocial or mental health impacts on the community when making protective action decisions. And maybe most importantly, is I think we have a tool here for improved risk communications. And that is a subtext, I think, in a lot of what was discussed today, is how do we communicate those relative risks? How do we communicate our decision-making to stakeholders who may not understand the radiological risk or appreciate the potential psychosocial or mental health risk associated with protective actions. So our final slide is a summary and maybe a primer for discussion. But what we've done is noted that the development of a non-radiological CVERT for psychosocial detriment from protective action definitely requires future research. And so we could not generate it at this time. Although I think as a communication tool, that would be an unbelievably valuable tool to have in our pockets to explain that cost-benefit analysis that we might do in the decision-making. We know that psychosocial impacts measured with general and summary indicators are interrelated and therefore cannot be summed, which limits our ability to create that non-radiological CVERT. But we also know that individual psychosocial impacts can be measured and they can be compared to a radiological impact, as we have done. So in this case, a single measured psychosocial impact, depression, we note has a very important and significant impact on the outcome for the population following an evacuation or a relocation. These types of tools, I think, are definitely needed both to justify and optimize decision-making in nuclear emergencies. I think the point that we're at now in terms of justification is that the ICRP reference levels that are generally used are considered to be justified at this point. So the tool would then allow us to optimize within those justified levels. However, I think there's an argument that we may need to redo the justification of the reference levels in the context of the results of this type of analysis, because it demonstrates, and I think also following Fukushima Daiichi, I think there's a recognition that the psychosocial impacts may be far more significant than the radiological impacts on the health of the population post-nuclear emergency. So the question then, if anybody has some suggestions for me, I would love to hear them, is what do we need to add or what do we need to do to improve this type of tool so that it could be actually implemented in an emergency? This is the end of my presentation. I welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Tristan. Excellent presentation, and thank you for sharing your your approach and the tools that are being developed. So you asked for advice and input. I have no doubt you will find lots of that in the questions that have been put into the chat. So similar to our Monsieur Collier's presentation, we'll go through a few of these, but due to the time, I think it would be best if you go through them, the ones that we don't have an opportunity to complete, and provide a typed answer for all of us to reflect on. So starting at the top with Monsieur Heureux's question specifically, it really, my understanding of the question, it really comes down to the quality of life question. So while the CLI in France exchanged and discussed with the population about emergency and post-accident situations, we see that for most, it wasn't really about dose or how much they were exposed to. The fundamental basic question, and I think this goes beyond just your presentation, it comes back to the individual about sort of their life, their family's life, continuing what they had before, and what conditions can be brought back to make that happen. I don't know if you can share your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I went through the literature review very quickly at the beginning, but remember there were these key drivers, which were effectively the residence-related factors and the risk perception and the socioeconomic influences of these decisions. And if we dig in to where those come from, I think these are really predicated on this issue of quality of life and also the ability to for self-determination of the population to make their decisions relative to their perspectives or perception of risk versus the value that is offered by remaining in place and maintaining traditions, cultures, locations, and roots. The evidence is fairly clear that those are the main drivers, as opposed to radiation dose. And in fact, I think while this tool is not designed to demonstrate that, I think it does ultimately, when you start looking at how we assign those quality of life years relative to the mental and psychosocial health, the tool would suggest, as we did see at the $100,000 quality level, that evacuation, even at the reference levels, because remember we were using default levels, so that was at the up to 100 millisieverts for the population within 20 kilometers, became more costly, ultimately more costly in quality of life than evacuation. Sorry, we can't hear you, Heidi.
It was bound to happen at least once. Thank you for that. The next question we have comes back to a notion from your perspective. Is there not also a category between radiation-induced effects and psychosocial impacts? And the examples given is the death of the 45 people at the IC ward of Futuba was not really psychosocial, and neither was it radiation induced, nor were the more than 2,000 casualties in the Fukushima prefecture. So how do you include those emergency preparedness and response related health effects into the model that you're looking at, or have you included it?
Yeah, clearly the answer is no. We have not included those health effects. But I did ask for feedback and what we need to add to this tool in order to make it usable in a real life situation. And to me, I think this is an excellent example. The research project that we took on was really to quantify those psychosocial impacts and not necessarily the outcomes of the logistical difficulties of evacuation, which are definitely things that should be included in the concept of a protection strategy. So I would say that at this point, our research and tool aim to quantify that psychosocial piece, but for a decision maker, there is a need to incorporate certainly the risk. There's those physical risks basically associated to the logistics of evacuating a population that are maybe more immediate than the psychosocial impacts. And if we, as decision makers, can take all of those things into account, that would be the object of a protection strategy.
Thank you. The next point is more of a comment from our colleague Simon Carroll, and he just provides a link to the non-radiological. So thank you very much for that, Simon, much appreciated. And while the last three questions are extremely interesting and probably will provide you with some insights as to how to improve your tool, keeping within sort of the spirit of what we're talking about a little bit more, I will jump down to Caterinelle Turcanu's question with regards to where is the place for stakeholder involvement in your analysis? Because I think that speaks to the heart of some of the things we're trying to look at as well through these webinars. Also, what about the intangible aspects that cannot be quantified, as we heard from Commissioner Bond, some things you just cannot quantify. And then finally, are there different publics rather than one uniform public? So perhaps you can take a bite of that first initial one. And then as we go ahead, if you can please just refer back to the chat and provide your answers for the remaining 3 or 4 questions that we have left. Thank you.
Certainly, thank you. So with regards to the question of stakeholder involvement, at this stage as a research project and a tool that we're a proof of concept tool, we have not included stakeholder development stakeholder input into the development of the tool. However, I see the usefulness of this tool as a communication tool to help explain and rationalize to stakeholders how psychosocial impacts and mental health impacts need to be incorporated. So the tool, in the research, we definitely came upon the influence of stakeholder discussions, self-determination, self-help actions, and the importance of those self-help actions in an emergency and in a recovery situation. But the tool I would suggest comes from the other side of the fence, which is a tool to communicate those relative risks. So I think we as health physicists are generally comfortable with the radiological risks. We as health physicists are generally not comfortable with the psychosocial impacts. And it's a learning process. And as Commissioner Bond was suggesting, this would be a multidisciplinary approach in order to incorporate these issues. So for me, this is a first step towards being able to quantify and understand the relative impact of the psychosocial tools, and maybe speaks to the importance of that stakeholder involvement as we understand that the psychosocial and mental health outcomes of the decisions that we make relative to radiological detriment are very important for those stakeholders that we are going to be interacting with.
All right. Well, thank you for that. We do need to prepare for the next session, and I thank you for your time with us here today. And I think it's a very important topic, as you can gather from all of the questions that are in the chat. I would like the opportunity for each of our colleagues who have provided a question for you to get back to them. I know when we break, we will probably lose some of these. I hope that you will have a chance to maybe look at them and maybe get back to either the NEA or the individuals that have asked, and also continue the questions that you've asked within the discussion groups that we have next. And thank you again for your time, and thank you to everyone for your participation. As noted, it is an area, a field of great interest, and different perspectives are exactly what we are looking for and need to, as was mentioned before, debate. So this is the end of the first part of this webinar, and that is it for today, for this morning. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Haiti, to you, our moderator, and all of our excellent speakers, and all you that participated so actively. As Haiti said, we will make sure to capture all of those questions that are still outstanding, even after this link is no longer active, to make sure that we provide feedback and follow up to all of you. Thank you very much for joining us today. Just as a reminder, our next webinar, the third in the series, will take place on February 8th. Please do register for that. We very much want to see this level of engagement and dialogue. You can also follow the NEA on Twitter and LinkedIn to keep in touch with us and receive updates on our programs, such as this one and other events that will be coming up. Again, thank you very much and have a good rest of the day.